So we left off last time talking about Rousseau, which is what we'll continue with today. And in particular, we'll look at the part that we didn't finish, which is part of Rousseau's argument for freedom in the state or in society. Then look a little bit at his idea about the general will. And then connect it back to our topic of self-determination, and then we'll move on to next. That'll be all the Rousseau we will see. So here is where we left off last time. So if you remember, Rousseau's argument has three parts, right? He wants to tell you a story about why the state as a whole, or the collective, the community, has moral standing. Why there is a moral nature to the community as an agent or an independent entity. And he actually thinks that, in some sense, the moral standing, the rights, the freedoms that we have as individuals, they come from the community to us. So we don't have rights or freedoms that we can claim against the community. We lay all those things down. It's a part of all the natural rights that we have to give up, abandon, surrender, as we sign the social contract. And then that's the natural liberty that we are giving up. He thinks that's a crappy, unequal, unfree one. Where you get instead, right, in its place, that the community grants you your rights and your freedoms, and then whatever democratically gets decided. And that's the better stuff. That's civil liberty. That's what true freedom is to be found. Now, remember the argument is like, first there's a theory about what freedom is. Two parts, independence and autonomy. Right? So absence of other people's wills determining your actions. That's the independence part, the negative part. Then there's the positive part. That's the first. The negative is the absence of other people determining what you're going to do. Then the positive part is that you're actually positively in charge, autonomous. And so he says, when you're in a social contract society, in society that's governed by a social contract, you'll be independent in the sense that no other person will have the ability, the power. Not a lot of space here. The power to determine what you're going to do, because nobody has that standing. And that's the result of everybody surrendering their rights. That was I hope you thought about the reading questions for today. The first reading question had to do with that, right? Because once we all give up our rights to the community, that means that no one has that standing to say, no, but my rights are being violated, and that means that the community has to change its ways because of how it's treated me. No one has that standing, so no one has the ability to tell others how they together should live, and that means that you're never subject to anyone saying that to you. And he thinks if everybody does that symmetrically, then we're all equally independent. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Isn't that kind of going against this? Because the police think they have the authority over these people who are violating others' rights.
So you mean like it's the will of the police officer to that's telling you what to do or what not to do? Is that
yeah, kind of, because the collectors, they appoint the police officers and they have the rules written that the society is split by.
Right.
So the officer's job is to enforce those rules.
Right. So yeah, so if the officer does that, right, and just enforces the community's rules, then it's not just the police officer enforcing his own will, right, or what he wants. So that you're not, in that case, Rousseau would say, you're not dependent on or subject to the individual police officer, because it's really the community sort of through the officer, like the officer is carrying out the will of the community, and the will of the community is. Well, it's not no one particular will, right? It's the will of all combined, including your own. And so then he's going to say, well, that's of course if the police officer abuses his office and starts doing something else, right? Then enforcing the rules of the community. Now the police officer is substituting his own will for what the community's will should be. Right? So the community will says one thing, and the police officer does something else. Now it's no longer the community acting through the police officer. Now it's the police officer just bossing you around, and that's a violation of the ideal. So he thinks that would be something that the community would have standing to punish if they wanted to. Did that help? Yeah? Yeah, Tamir?
What if, pretty much the same situation is that this person isn't a police officer, but they're acting basically stopping on time? Are they?
Just like by themselves?
Yeah.
Yeah, like a John Wayne type vigilante? Yeah. Yeah, it's a very good question. So you mean like they're not appointed, but in terms of the content, they get everything right?
They're
Right.
doing they're doing what the police should be doing, but
Right.
they're not.
Like Batman or something. Right? Yeah.
How would,
Well, I guess Batman is using like illegal means. Right?
people's rights as no one has officially accepted them as being able to do so?
Right. It's a very good question. I mean, Rousseau doesn't address that, right? So we'd have to speculate about what he would say. Usually, followers of Rousseau don't like that idea very much. And the argument they give is something like this. It's like, well, there's something wrong with a person putting themselves in that spot, even if the content of what they're doing is correct. But it's wrong that they put themselves in that spot, because by putting themselves in that spot instead of being appointed, they still say, my interpretation about what this community is about, that's the thing I'm going to inform. Now, you happen to get it right. Okay, good. Right? But it's still, you shouldn't be putting yourself in that spot. If you believe in Rousseau's ideal about we're supposed to be equal under the law as democratic citizens, then you should believe that the only person who has standing to do that is going to be the appointee of the community, and not just you. So there's a kind of arrogance to it, they would say. But that's extending the theory a little, right? That seems to be the way that most people read it, though. But yeah. In principle, you could say, I don't think there's anything necessarily inconsistent about what you're proposing. Might go against the spirit of it. All right, so this is the argument we said last time, right? So this is about the laying down of the rights, and then the enforcement of your rights by the community. That guarantees your independence, that you're not going to be subject to any one king or nobleman or warlord or whatever, right? Like who's going to just enforce his or her rules upon you. And so that is a part of freedom. That's the negative part of freedom. Here are questions for you. I won't dwell on them because we'll need the time. But you can think about, is there an ideal about independence here, right, that Rousseau is going after? And he's saying this laying down of the rights means that you're not dependent on the unilateral will. Nobody has the standing to tell you that. Let's say that's true. Is that enough for it to be independent, you might wonder. Later we'll see Rousseau thinks very importantly in a democracy the laws are self-imposed, that you're both legislator and subject at the same time by having a vote. He thinks that happens once everybody completely abandons their rights, and you should ask yourself whether that's correct, whether by having no rights against the community, whatever the rule is, you're going to be self-imposing that on you. Anyway, those are key claims that you should wonder. Here's the second part. Right? Second part about why life under the social contract is going to be free. It's independent, A, and B, it's autonomous. Now, remember we said all the way in the beginning, autonomy for Rousseau, he doesn't use the word autonomy, that's me using it. But he is talking about freedom as a kind of, I think you said it last time, like a kind of free will idea, right? Like it's more than just the absence of other people deciding what you're going to be doing, but also you taking really like mature, fully developed, independent, homegrown decisions about what you're going to do. So there's space between these two, right? So I think I used this example last time. Like a tree, for example, like the tree in my backyard, nobody's telling the tree where to grow, right? Like it has no boss, it has no sovereign, it has no law, whatever. Like maybe laws of physics or something, whatever, different type of law. Right? It's not getting penalties, it's not getting fines or whatever if it doesn't grow in the right way. It just grows, right? So it's independent, but it's not autonomous. It's not making any decisions either about where to grow. It's not thinking about, maybe towards the sun is better than, it's an automatic process, right? And so that's a tree. Of course, trees doesn't really move, doesn't really have any type of will, but certain animals, for example, there's a spectrum between us and a tree, right? Like where a certain animal, like an ant, for example, makes, in some sense, maybe, like I'm not sure if you can call them decisions, but they do stuff, right? In the sense that the tree doesn't do so. They move around, they pick up things, and they carry them back to the nest. They fight wars, stuff like that, But it's probably not true to think that an ant is autonomous. Right? It's not really making, like if you put a pheromone in the air, then the ant will just follow. Like if you have a trace of sugar water on the ground or something, the ant will just go, and like it'll be this row of ants going, right? And that's why ant traps work, right? Like, pull the ants, and by mass they just walk in there, and they die. People aren't exactly like that, right? At least not the normal or well-functioning people. And that's the difference between us and the ant in terms of autonomy. Like we can actually think about how much sugar should I take, right? Like the ant is just, more sugar is better. Right? And so that's the thing that's the positive part of freedom, right? To be free. So an ant or a tree for Rousseau is not capable of this type of freedom. They might be independent, but they're not going to be autonomous, and so they're not going to be capable of the kind of freedom that you and I are capable of. Because you and I can be both independent, not having somebody dictating how we should live, and positively autonomous, where we ourselves are we have an own will that is developed enough to make that kind of decision. So little kids, right? I have a 1-year-old. He's not yet autonomous, right? He's not really. He makes decisions about. He says no to things, right? But he doesn't make a plan, right? He doesn't have a life plan or something. Like if he says no to something and you can distract him for 10 minutes, it's over. And it's the next thing. And so you can see it's already a lot more than a year ago, right? But it's not fully autonomous yet, right? And so people, as they grow up, they start developing more and more that type of planning capacity. So that's developing into a free human being, Rousseau thinks. If you're interested in Rousseau's idea, Rousseau is one of the first persons to come up with theory of education in his perhaps more famous even in the social contract. This is a book called Emile. That's in some ways the founding of the theory of education. Is something about helping to develop the autonomy of human beings. All right. So back to what he's saying in the social contract. Okay, what is he talking about? Well, he says our will. Like as adults, it's not purely autonomous, right? It's not this perfectly developed thing that never misfires or doesn't have any pollutions or problems in it, right? Our will is actually a combination of two things. It has that true and rational will in it, the autonomous part, like our better selves, if you will. Right? And then there's a bunch of stuff around it, which he calls pluses and minuses, sometimes translated as excesses and insufficiencies. Think about sometimes we behave a little more like the ants than we want to, right? Like so, we eat more sugar than we probably should or want. Walk past the cupboard, there's cookies in there. I'm not even that hungry. Eating too many cookies as it is. And I reach in and there's yet another cookie, right? Like this tiny craving or something. And I know I kind of shouldn't, but the craving for the cookie takes over. Right? So it's a mild form. You can think of more extreme forms, right, like addiction. Right? So people are addicted to smoking, for example. They want to quit. They try to quit. They're better. Like part of their will says, I ought not to be smoking. It's unhealthy. It's expensive. Stinky. Whatever, right? I want to stop. Lay down these cigarettes. Throw them away. Flush them down the toilet. Whatever you do, and you lapse, right? And so there's part in you that takes over at some point. There's these two competing parts. The part that wants to quit, and there's the part that wants to smoke. And Rousseau is one to say there's two parts that are not equally important or equally valuable. One part we see as sort of truer to ourselves, or closer to who we really want to be. And the other part can take over. So you can be a slave to your addiction somehow. I get to use a term that sometimes people use. Like these addicted people are sort of moved around by their addiction. Like, of course, drug addicts is the most extreme case, right? Like people whose whole life gets turned over by their desire for drugs, no matter what the cost and dangers and so on might be. So that's the thing that he wants to say, right? So here it's like, look, there's two parts in your wills: the excesses and insufficiencies. So there's excess desire for nicotine or what, sugar or heroin, whatever it may be. Maybe we have one of our excesses is we are overly prideful or something, right? Like you're irate, like somebody insults you and you get way more angry about it than you should be. Like you have an excess of pride. You know deep down that you're overreacting, but still you can't help it, right? And then there's insufficiency, sort of lack of things, or lack of self-control, like this smoke, like the cigarette addict, has. Or maybe we're not insufficiently confident about ourselves. You care about other people's opinions too much. You do things because it's the kind of popular thing to do, or you think otherwise people might laugh at you, and you're insufficiently self-confident. And you think, well, it's not about the other people's opinions, it's about what you want to do. So, that's the first claim, that we have both these parts, right? And then here, it says, well, if there's these two parts, then there's this rational part, and that's not that one, right? It's the different. So the x's and the pluses and the minuses is one part, that's the temptations. Sometimes we call these biases nowadays, like when we exaggerate things. And then there's the rational part, that's the other part, right? So if we were truly rational, then we would have these pluses and minuses, the excesses and insufficiencies taken out. Right? Purge ourselves of those. All right, so then there's this idea about reasoned convictions, right? Our true and rational wills contain only our reasoned convictions. It's like the true and rational part. All right. Now to the general will. So the general will, this is just the definition. This is it's a term of art, right? Like a technical term that Rousseau is designing. What is the general will? The general will is everybody's, like you all have these true and rational parts, and I have a true rational part, and then the parts of our will, those parts of our wills together, that's the general will. If such a thing exists, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but that's just how he defines it, right? That's what I'm talking about, Rousseau says, when I'm talking about the general will. It's the will of everybody, but only the true and rational parts, not the biased part, not the insecure part, not the addicted part, not the whatever part, not the angry part. Right? So, then it follows that the general will, there's a difference then, right, because it's the true and rational part of everybody, there's a difference, he makes this distinction in the book between the general will and just the will of all. Right? The will of all would be everybody, individuals' particular wills added on top, but that has all the particularities and all of the crappy parts of our wills in there, right? So his general will is sort of the purged version, right? The cleaned up version that we like. And so then the general will is the true and rational will of all people in society. So, if it's true, right, that in a society that's governed by the social contract, people are governed by the general will, big if, right? Haven't seen that yet, right? But if that's true, then, and it's true that the general will contains the will of all, but the good part, and it's true, right, that acting on the good part of your will makes you free, then you can see how the argument goes, right? Then a society based on the social contract will make you free. Because we'll put in place the general will. The general will is this true and rational part of your will, and the true and rational part of your will is what makes you free. So that's how the three steps of the argument collapse together again. So here. If the argument succeeds, right, then it shows that if a society's laws are based on the general will, it will guarantee people's freedom. Doesn't show yet that it's true, right? That the general will is actually in place. But if he could show that, then he would be, looks like he's there. All right, does anyone have any questions about this? Any thoughts? Yeah, sure.
So how do you describe a true and irrational will?
Yeah, good question. So, good. How would we describe a true and rational will? Does anyone want to give it a shot? What's a true and rational will? Or what do we have in mind here?
I don't know, just with the cookies example, you know that too much sugar is bad for you, because that's the fact. You know it's actually food. You know that you can have one cookie maybe or two cookies a day, that's no problem, nothing will happen to you. So you'll have one or two cookies, but not more.
And that which one is the true and rational part?
Well, the true part is that scientifically proven is that you have too much sugar and I don't know, all that stuff. And rational is just knowing that, well, too much sugar, rational speaking, that probably is good for me.
Right.
I'm going to be rational about not have more than one cookie, so I want more.
And what would be the, like, can you give an example of the opposite? Like, what would not be the...
Just being like, well, you have had two cookies. Well, the normal thing, you had two cookies, and then instead of just being like, well, I'll stop, just continue.
Right. Just keep eating. Right.
Thank you.
Right. So, yeah, and the idea here is that Rousseau connects this to freedom, right? So for Rousseau, the true and rational part, which is stopping at 2 cookies, maybe, instead of eating the whole pack every day. There's something better about that, right? Like you can see that if you had to choose by which part you would live, right? You'd probably choose to have the self-control to stop at 2, if that's or 1 or 3, whatever the number is going to be, right? Whatever you see as an appropriate amount of self-control. And so that when we don't, like some often call it weakness of the will, right? So like what it means is like there is your actual will, which is the thing that would stop you after 2 cookies. And then that thing is weak, right? So something else takes over and grabs control of you, and there your hand goes, and there the cookie goes, right? So it's weakness of the will, and so what it means is like that, to be free, he says, is to be guided by your own will and nobody else's will. All right, well, so if weakness of the will means being failing to live by the thing that's putting you in charge of limiting yourself to 2 cookies, then that's the thing that's making you free, living by that thing. So naturally speaking, it's not a guarantee that we're going to be free if there's nobody else bossing you around, because you might be this like unlimited cookie eater and cigarette addict and way too occupied with what other people think about you and irate or what, like there might be all these things that constantly interfering with your life that are weaknesses of the will that stop you from living by your own will. Those are moments you're closer to the end, right? Like it's just the smell of the cookie takes over, right? Or the craving for the nicotine. It's just a chemical process, just like the pheromone at the ant trap attracts the nicotine attracts you to the cigarette, even though you know, like I don't really want to.
But would that not be at least, well, not rational, but it's a fact that you are addicted, that your body needs the nicotine? Isn't that then like a true thing?
Yeah, sure, that's true. Yeah.
It's bad, but like the fact in the moment is if you don't have your cigarette or whatever it is, you're suffering. So
it's true, yeah, sure, it's a fact, and it's true that you would be suffering and so on. But that doesn't mean that when you do it, it's really an exercise of your will like you'd still recognize it as it's a problem, right? So it's a lack of willpower. So something else is the addiction that's overriding your will in that case. And of course, it's true that your addiction is in you. But, so Rousseau's making a pretty bold claim here, right? He's saying he's not saying there won't be any addicts anymore in a democratic society, right? But he is saying that insofar as living together goes, our rights, our freedoms, the things that government is occupied with, that part, like the laws that we live under, those will not be ever based on prejudice, on temptation, on laziness, on a desire to sort of freeload, or whatever there might be, whatever you choose your weakness of the will, right? The laws will only be based on that true and rational part that we see, like the part that we can really see as like, okay, this is what I want to stand for, right? If I can control myself. No fear, right? no exaggerated anger or something. Like all these things are going to get stripped out, he says. All right. Do you have a feeling you got a handle on this or not? It's conditional so far, right? He's just saying, like, hey, if it's true that there is such a thing as a general will, and I can show you that a society will have it, then you're going to be free, because you're going to be independent and autonomous.
So basically, the general rule is the same as just moral rights. Moral rights is compatible, comparable?
It depends. That sentence, like that, philosopher in me wants to say the sentence is too short. Right? What do you explain a little more?
Moral rights as far as to treat all your citizens, all the people in your society humanely.
Yeah. So, well, the general will. So, in the theory, right? A society is legitimate and free and self-determining and whatever, right? Blah blah blah. Right? All the things that he wants. A society is that only if it's governed by the general will. And so the general will sets all the laws in place. Now, you know already that all your rights are going to be determined by the law, right? Because you have no rights to insist on except what the law gives you. So in that sense, yeah, the general will defines your rights. Now, this might sound scary. You think, well, it could be anything, right? But, of course, the general will to him means it involves your will, and then the good part, not the scared part, or not the irate part, not the addicted part, whatever, right? It's just the good part. And so your rights and my rights and everybody's rights are going to be based on that, on the good part of your will. And he thinks that will lead to something like what maybe you have in mind with moral rights. So it's going to lead to equality, because everyone's going to have the same rights, because we all are equally subject to the law. And it's going to lead to a type of freedom that we can jointly enjoy. Not one person's freedom at the expense of another group or something, right? And so on and so on. Are we getting?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Right?
It seems to me the general will is just it's trying to achieve what you forfeited at the beginning, which was your natural rights. You see, the distinction, I don't understand why this argument needs to exist in the first place. So the rational part of your will, as we've discussed, with like the addict, for example.
Yeah.
As the addict knows, what's actually good for him is, to not have, the next, bit of alcohol.
Right.
But the will always, there's no situation where someone acts in the will against what they think is good for them. Because even the alcoholic who knows that he should not have any more alcohol sees the good of that satisfaction of having that one more drink as outweighing the unbearable displeasure of
Sure.
not having that one more drink. So the will always follow what we take to be the good for us. And if what is the good for us is what's kind of what we're naturally ordered to, which is, not alcoholism in that particular instance, because our bodies aren't meant for that, then that is something that is, grounded in a sort of natural law.
Good, yeah. Thanks, Socrates. Socrates said, I'm not trying to, Socrates actually gives this argument in,
Really?
yeah, I think in the Republic, if I'm right. Anyway, another place. So, anyway, but there's a discussion in Plato about weakness of the will. Akrasia is a word in Greek. And the question that Socrates raises is like, how is this even possible, right? So weakness of the will would be like a failure of the will to guide your action. And then the challenge is, well, aren't you always just sort of like, even when the alcoholic has the other drink, then in some respect the alcoholic makes the decision to take the drink, so he must deem that to be the right thing to do at the time, right? The thing worth doing is to have the other drink. So if that's true, then how can you say that the will is not in charge anymore, right? That's the will working. Now you might not like it or something, right? But there it goes. So yeah, that's a tough question, right? Like how can most people think, and Rousseau definitely thinks, but you're right, you can challenge this, But most people think that there is sort of at least a hierarchy among different parts of the will. Maybe it's both times the will really being in charge, but they're not equally good, right? Or not equally close to who you want to be or something. Maybe there's a ranking, right? That we say, well, it's part of my will that I want alcohol because I'm addicted, but it's also part of my will that I don't want that addiction to be there, to be part of my will. Harry Frankfurt, if you've ever heard of him, the famous philosopher who's still with us, fortunately, he made a different distinction between first and second order desires. And just the idea being, the first order desire is just a desire for something, alcohol. And then the second order desire is like one step back, right? So here's the thing you want, the beer, right? Here's your desire for the beer, and that's first order. And then there's a second order desire, which is the desire to have or not have that desire for the beer, right? And so he says you can have a desire not to have a desire, right? You want no longer to be addicted to beer, to alcohol, to cigarettes, or to what have you. And Frankfurt thinks that these type of desires are, like, it's more important that we get these things satisfied than to get the first order one satisfied. So it's more important to us that we get, like, what is more important to you, like for the addict? Is it to get the next drink? Well, maybe in the moment it is, but really from like a point of view of life or something, it's that you get rid of those type of desires, right? And so that's why they check into rehab facilities. It's like they can't do it by themselves, so they try to force themselves in a situation where that desire gets removed. Now again, that's not, there's lots of ways where you can drive wedges and you can wiggle and question, but that's at least Rousseau thinks that, and that's not a crazy thing to say, right? There seems to be an intuition there that lots of people share. I tend to think that some version of it is probably true. Whatever the correct way of putting it is. Yeah, there's a lot more to, but anyways. Did that help? Okay. All right, so here's a drawing. I hope this will help. So the general will is supposed to be the true will of all, right? So the true will being the true and rational part, the good part, and then the general will is the overlap of every individual person in society, their true wills. So think of this just a Venn diagram, 1, 2, 3 people in society. Of course, there's going to be many, many more than 3 people in a society, but 3 will show you how it might work. Now, each bubble here is just their will, the totality of it, including the addictions, the desires for cookies, beer, cigarettes, whatever, other people's approval. And then there's the true will, or the rational will, whatever, that part that we think is better, right? At least some people think is better. More closer to yourself. And so that's going to be the pluses and minuses, or the biases, or whatever, right? So here's what person 1, he has the pluses and minuses, and then there's the true will, right? And then person 3 has the same, person 2. And so their true will has to do with a whole bunch of stuff, right? It's to do with themselves, how they want to live, with their families, with how much they want to exercise and whatever, right? But also has to do with how they want to live together with other people. And so there's going to be overlap, right? Overlap between their wills about how they want to live together. What 3 and 1 have in common is this section here, right? And then what 1 and 2 have in common is going to be this section. Is that right? Yeah. So now the general will is going to be the overlap between each individual person's, their rational part of their will, as it pertains to how they want to be with other people. And for Rousseau, the point of freedom is to live in a society where the laws are based on this part, whatever overlap that might exist between all the people. Not just all the people in their will, whatever it may be, but all the people in the good parts of their will. And so we hope, right, we hope that there is such an overlap, that the circles aren't sort of like fully drifted apart, where people want such opposite things. Talked last time, I think, about like ethnically divided societies. where the division might be so deep that there is no overlap, that they just want things that are completely different from each other. Rousseau seems to think that if we really have our true wills in sight, that won't exist, there will be overlap. But that's the idea anyway. So I could actually put like another line around here, but like when these overlap is that's the realm of politics, right? That's not the private action, but public sphere. And then the general will is going to be that part of the politics where the general will, where the overlap between every circle takes place. Does that help? I don't know. Again, this is just a concept, right? It's just the idea. What does he mean when he talks about general will? He says this thing. Every individual person wants a whole bunch of stuff, good and bad, good and bad, good and bad. And when there is overlap between how we're going to be together of the good parts, that's your general will, between those people. How many more people should there be? If there's a fourth person, then that's going to be another circle, and that there should be an overlap within the general will with that person too, and so on. So you want a whole bunch of stuff. I want a whole bunch of stuff. There's going to be some overlap between you want and I want, that is stuff that we both see as not biased in any way, but rationally defensible. And some of that stuff is going to be about how we ought to live together. That's that decision that we can agree upon, truly, rationally, about how to live together. That's the basis for law, he says. That's what he calls the general will. Okay? So an example, right? Like law against murder, right? Don't just murder people. Do I truly and rationally endorse that, or is it just my fear? Well, I'm afraid of being murdered, to be sure, but it's also something that I endorse. I don't think it's just an irrational fear. I'm not, not a coward for one. I actually think I see good reasons for wanting to be in the society. And then the idea is that for each and every one of us, we can see that, right? And so each and every one of us freely, autonomously wants to live in a society without murder. That puts the law against murder here. Because it's something about, not just about me, how many times I exercise, or how many cookies I eat, or whatever. Right? Like, it's going to be about how we live together, so it's a political issue. And it's something that I can endorse, and you can endorse, and everyone presumably can endorse. And so there's your case. Right. Right?
Again, it seems to me that whatever the general will is going to be, what people are all going to agree upon, or what we already take to be our natural rights. And so it makes no sense to me to forfeit them in the first place if you're just going to get them just in a... It's like, leaving town to come back into town a different route. It's just, why?
I think it's more to, of an equal standpoint, to kind of start fresh kind of thing. Like, everything's gone, we're all the same, now let's build up. Instead of reminiscing on the past things, the things that were, that aren't anymore. We build from the same level.
As natural rights would be from the same level. We are all, by nature, the same, humans, for instance.
But unfortunately, that's an opinion of people.
That is not an opinion. That's not what a right, what a natural right means by definition. It is a right that is in the nature of what the respective subject is.
So that's the thing that Sydney is bringing up here is important. I'll get to you in a second. The thing that brings up here is important because remember what Rousseau thinks freedom is, right? Freedom is ultimately living by your own will. So it does really matter whether you can see the rights that are being put in place by the community as rights that you accept. Otherwise, they're just external impositions. Then you're no longer independent. It's somebody else's idea about rights that are being forced upon you. So for Rousseau, it's going to matter that you yourself endorse these rights, and he thinks any view of natural rights is going to lead to whose natural rights, right? Like, do you have a list? Yeah. Does everybody agree? Probably not. Right? So then we have to have a vote, or maybe we just have a fight, or something. Like somebody's idea about natural rights is going to be imposed on others, and that's the thing he doesn't want, because that's not independence. That's somebody else being in charge of how you're going to live. Ideally, we'd all live under rules that we all equally accept. That's I'm not saying that's right and you're wrong, right? I'm saying that's in the best I can put it, the Rousseau style answer. Yeah, no, I mean the opposite view is that there are certain natural rights that are just the actual true ones, and if you're rational, then you're going to accept that, and if not, then you're not, right? So, right. But Rousseau followers usually don't accept that because they think it's really important that you have that connection between your own free will, as it is, not as you dictated or I dictated, right? As it is, and that will accepts or supports or creates the laws under which you live. Anyway, that's the dispute. Mike? Anthony?
I think when given a natural society, like a chart like this would be a lot more difficult because you wouldn't be able to...
Sorry, say that again?
A chart like this on the screen would be a lot more difficult in a natural society because you wouldn't be able to overlap people
right.
and define what the general will was. That's why you had to come up with the general will so you could figure out the basis of the society to create the laws around. If you had a natural society, it would be like splitting those circles apart and then trying to find the general will in the circles while they're independent of each other.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a worry that any Rousseauian has to deal with, right? Like, what if disagreement is so big that there is no overlap? One solution that like modern day Rousseauians sometimes give is they say, well, if somebody is like so out of here, right? Their bubble is so out of here that there is no overlap, then they're just unreasonable. So they don't, like, basically their wills consist only of the crappy parts, and that's a person who doesn't count, right? Because we're trying to deal with the autonomous. I mean, they say they use fancier language, but that's basically the argument, and you get in murky waters very quickly, I think. But now, if that's not true, if it is true that there is going to be someone who's completely not overlapping and still as autonomous as the rest, then the Rousseauian has to give up on the ideal, right? Then the thing explodes. It's just not possible to have a society in which people are truly equal and free. Right. Claudia, you had a hand up a second. Yeah. Jeff, did you want to?
I think that's what you just said, but so like the person that's outside and doesn't overlap at all, like the narcissist or something like that, right? That just doesn't care, collapses this entire theory.
Well, not if the truth. Like, so some people are going to be like there's crazy people, right?
Right.
So some people are crazy. They're going to be way out here, right?
Right.
But they're not autonomous. That's why.
They're not.
So like my kid, right? He's not autonomous yet. So what he wants does not overlap with the general will. He has a hard time understanding it, and if it means like he doesn't get candy all the time or something, then so he's not going to accept it. So, but that doesn't count. He's not quite developed enough yet, right?
Right.
So maybe there are some people who are not 1-year-olds, but 20-year-olds or something,
Right.
whose mental states are not well developed enough. So their point of view could. So we disenfranchise some people, right?
Yeah.
And that so the Rousseauian might say, well, if a person is laying out of the circles that far because they have significant mental problems or something, well, then it's not a problem because that doesn't qualify as someone who's truly autonomous. Right? Their will is malformed, at least in terms of the theory. Now, but that's a big thing to say about a person, right?
Right. That's what I'm saying.
Right.
It's just because they're outside of they don't overlap, right, at all. What about the person who just smokes cigarettes and doesn't care if they die? You know what I mean? That doesn't really make them crazy, maybe stupid, but
right.
Crazy.
Right. Yeah, so, that might not be a political issue, right? Maybe we've made it a political issue, but that's a mistake. We should just leave that be a personal issue.
Right.
But at least you'd have to give an example of where somebody has that type of sort of addict-like reasoning about a truly political issue, right? Okay. And I mean, I'm sure you can come up if you think a little bit with, I mean, I don't know, right?
Yeah.
If you can, that's a real worry, right? So, like I said, some of the modern day, like the modern followers of Rawls, for example, I mentioned last time, they use a lot of these Rousseauian ideas. And they by definition say somebody who's like that is unreasonable, and they just don't count. So they just have to take whatever rights and laws the reasonable people, which is them and their friends, right, whatever they come up with. And so that gets
So to be
that
autonomous,
gets risky very quickly. Yeah.
you have to care about, right? So like
You have to care about like coming to some type of rational agreement with other people.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
For them, right? And if you don't, so if you want to be like the, I think Anthony brought this up last time. Like if you want to just live by yourself,
Yeah, yeah.
then you know that's a real problem. So the anarchist who wants to literally just out of beyond the woods and live in his cabin and be self-sufficient and not live under shared laws with other people in a society, who just wants to go at his own, that person is going to be not rational in this sense. Right? And that person is going to be just, they think you can force him to be free. Remember, that's Rousseau's, he's not free. He's acting on the back. That's a crappy part of his, he's biased. He's overly tempted by, or whatever. Maybe he's excessively, he's obsessed with not being in society with other people, not having to comply or follow, live with other people. BS. Force him to be free. That's not free. Right?
Yeah, right. So,
Yeah.
it-
It has some teeth, this theory.
yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not. I mean, that's Rousseau for you. He's not someone to compromise or sugarcoat his stuff. He thinks this is it. Deal with it. But of course, if you don't like it, then we have to go back to the arguments, right? The arguments are leading up to this. So if you don't like it, you can't just say, "Well, I don't like Rousseau. Screw that guy." Right? Like, you're going to have to try and figure out where in the arguments he goes wrong. Right?
I mean, I think like the anarchists living in the woods, they're not hurting anyone. And they're, you know what I mean? And they're just out there doing their thing,
Right.
growing tomatoes. Then what, I mean, it doesn't hurt society. It doesn't really help society, right? We're going to live in the woods
Right.
and die one day, you know? What is that? It doesn't affect the general will, you know what I'm saying? And it doesn't necessarily make them irrational just because they don't want to be part of a group.
Right.
In my opinion, you know
Sure.
what I mean? If you're not hurting anyone, what, you know, what the heck?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Well, what the heck? Yeah. Claudia?
Yeah, I was just wondering, does general will does it have to do with like politics or the politics of society? Because if you take, for example, I don't know, in Germany, the neo-Nazis. I mean, they still have some general will that they also believe that, you know, I don't know, I would hope that most of them believe
Right.
you shouldn't kill or you shouldn't, you know, you should treat your neighbor as a way, but you should only treat your neighbor who is maybe, you know, in a specific, you know, direction. You should only treat those the way you would treat yourself, not others. But do they still count as being part of the general will? Because like they do have some parts of that.
Yeah. Good. So, I mean, you're thinking about like some people's wills only partly overlap with.
Yeah, but that, but also does it have to be like a political thing? Does it have to be? Is general will just like general, like how I treat my neighbor the way
Oh, okay.
me, or is it more of a? Because if that's the grounds for laws, then it
Mhm.
also has to be somewhat a political thing, or just a, you know, like we agree on common laws or respecting all citizens and not maybe just some of them or stuff like that.
Right. So, I mean, Rousseau thinks that just what he means by general will is it's the will of all, the true will of all, as far as political things go. So whatever overlap we have, right? So on issues that concern both you and me, not just you and me, the two of us, because we can sort that out together, right? But you and me together as a society. So there's a bunch of, like, some issues are like, what am I going to wear today? Well, it concerns me and like maybe the other people that are going to see me today, but it's not a political issue, right? It doesn't really affect society or anything. But then there are other issues which really affect the way in which we live together as a community. And those issues, there's going to be a true will of all of us. And that thing he calls the general will. So
So So would you say that, like, for example, a neo-Nazi, he would be like part of the, would he be somebody who doesn't have a right for autonomy, or would he be somebody because he does have some general, because in some way you can put him in that circle, so
Right.
if his circle does connect with other circles, he's still in part of the group?
Yeah, so the neo-Nazi would want, they have views on political issues, right? But they're just going to be they're going to be views that he's going to that Rousseau would deem irrational. Right? So, for example, he would say the neo-Nazi is against equal rights for everybody, no matter what their race or ethnicity or whatever, right? So that is not part of the general will because it's not something it's not an overlap between everybody, right?
It has to be
Yeah,
done.
right. Because the other people who are the ones who are now like demoted to second-class citizens, they are not going to rationally accept that, right? If they accept it, some might accept it, but then they do it because they have a really, really bad opinion of themselves, right? Like there's these famous stories of happy slaves, right? People like live on plantations, and then actually ask that, like the time they ask them, would you want to be free? No, I'd much rather here because it's safe. I don't have to worry about it. Most people think, well, I mean, you might be beaten into that type of view where you really believe it, but that's not the real you, right? That's the you that comes out of oppression. That's not the free you. And so the free you couldn't accept being a second-class citizen just because of your skin color. And so if the neo-Nazi wants to make you a second-class citizen, then that preference of theirs, that opinion, is not in the general will because it's not something that you can overlap.
And so it's automatically irrational.
Right. For that reason, it has to be because it is part of the common issue, right? And so the argument would be they're either mistaken, just factually mistaken, so it's not true, right? About genetic differences or something. They're probably also ethically mistaken. They have like irrational moral beliefs about that even if there was an ethical genetic difference, that whether that should make any difference to their rights or freedoms. Why do they have that mistaken view? Well, maybe because they're overly scared of other people or so. I don't know what drives someone there, right? But there's going to be some type of story about like a cognitive irrational failure in how they arrive at that view, at least in Rousseau's view. So. Yeah, right?
So I think that actually is a very formidable objection to Rousseau's view, because it's only not a problem in the example that we gave where it's one, little renegade neo-Nazi. But, I mean, to continue with the Nazis, were the Nazis to have won World War II, and, let's just do for the thought experiment, that they just keep going and take over the world at this point. And so, the vast majority of people are Nazis, and say they can even manage to brainwash, whatever Jews they may have decided to spare into the Jews thinking that they themselves were not worthy. Rousseau is now committed to saying, if this is now the whole population, because the Nazis won, is this belief of, including the Jews at this point, the belief that, these Jews are not, worthy as people, as the Aryan race, or, whatever the Nazis are. Rousseau is committed to that, because that's then become the general will.
So that's why the true and rational part and the excesses and the pluses and the minuses thing matters for him, right? So he's going to say it's not enough that there's just overlap, right? Because that's the will of all. Are you on this point right here?
Yeah, well,
Okay.
I was going to go about what he said.
Yeah, go for it first. Okay.
Terms of America. So back when we had slavery, the general will was all people of color should be slaves. True.
No, not true. Cannot be true, right? Because it can only be true if you don't count the people of color.
We did count the people of color.
Right.
Then.
But that's against Rousseau's social contract, right? Because in the Rousseau's social contract, everybody has to be a member.
But what I was going to ask you was, so wouldn't that make America, the general will of America in 17 or whatever it was, that people of color, black people should be slaves?
Well, it would only if you don't count the blacks, right? And so that's of course the whole trick, because and Rousseau would say, and he does say these things explicitly, right? Like if not everybody equally is subject to the law, and not everybody equally has a vote in what the law then should be, the whole thing is messed up, right? And so if you get this system in place, could there be such a thing as slavery? Well, let's try, right? Like, would you accept it? No, right? They said, like, screw that, I don't want that. So, okay, that proposal is off the table. We can't get it through. So we'll see later, that's why he thinks democracy gets you to the general will, because democracy, if it's one man, one vote, and we all have a veto, it prevents any policy from being the kind where a minority or any group gets sacrificed by the others, right? Because the majority can't just say, well, there's 70% of us whites, and there's like 18% blacks, and then there's like a bunch of other ethnicities there, so we whites, we're going to just take away the rights of the other ones. Majority in favor, you can't do that, right? Because you're going to block it. And that's why the equality and the universal nature of it is so important for him. Because that's the thing that guarantees that you won't get these type of crappy results. And so, but set that aside, right? What he defines as the general will is just whatever that thing would be, right? And so if you just have an overlap between a group of people, even if it's a really big group of people, but it's not an overlap between everybody, then just by definition, it's not the general will, it's something else. It's just an overlap of a... Tamir, did you have your hand?
So then, the general will, there's like levels to it. Let's say in this classroom, all of us have a general will, but then once you include this whole building,
Right, good.
then everyone else's will gets put in place, and the overlap gets simply smaller and smaller. So it's just the scope of the change. Because I was thinking with the Nazi thing, if they were to take over the whole world, at that point, you wouldn't have the entire planet. And so, of course, no one's going to, there will be no general will. Like, there will be a portion of the population that doesn't believe that. So it's all about the scope of looking at
For the purpose of the thought experiment, that wasn't the case. For the purpose of the thought experiment, they managed to convince even the Jews that they weren't a tourist.
Oh, well then there's no argument. That's just
But it's not rational.
And that's what I'm saying. And that's what was my point earlier, was that that's clearly not rational. The general will, that's why it makes no sense to come to a conclusion by just alienating your natural rights. Because when it boils down to it, is we understand at that point that we appeal to this, rational will. What is the rational will? Well, it appeals to what we know to be our natural rights. What,
Yeah, so for Rousseau, it's not going to be appealing to natural rights. It's going to be appealing to your interests, the things you want, right? The things you want out of life with other people. So you kind of have to start from the ground up, he thinks, right? So start thinking about, okay, how would you like to live with other people? Well, you have a policy, you have a proposal of natural rights, and if that's the thing, that happens to be the thing that everybody else also thinks is a good way to live together, then fine. But only fine because we're all accepting it. Right? If it's not, if some people of us can rationally and reasonably have an objection to it, then that idea of natural rights has to go. And you can't keep appealing to it, right? Like you know better or something. That's this is Rousseau speaking, right? Like you know better.
forfeiting the objection then to the Nazis then, and then you just, if they had won and had everyone convinced, then what you're now defining as rational will, if it is the view and will of the collective whole of the entire planet at that point, I don't see how you're not committed.
Yeah, good. So you could have this just do it small scale, right? To me, it's here, this is a classroom. We could have a general will here, right? We could ask about what are the rules that we're going to have here, that we're going to live together in these hours here in this classroom, right? Set up some rules. Everybody has a vote. I propose something. If everybody agrees, then that's the rule. Right? Now, we could have a really crappy rule, right? For example, say everybody gets an A no matter what they do, right? All in favor, maybe all say yes. And even I might say all yeah, next. Right? Now, in that case, we're all accepting the rule that we live under. We created it ourselves. But for Rousseau, that's not going to be good enough. Right? Even though we all are endorsing it, we're not endorsing it for the right reasons. Right? Why are we accepting everybody gets an A? Because it's easy, right? Or because there's rewards later. Maybe if you lift your GPA and that gives you a better shot at getting a job later on. The right reason would be to want to get an A because you earned it, right? Because you got the material, you worked for it, you did your stuff, and then good philosophy class completed. There's your grade. That reflects that fact, right? Not not all these desires, not the laziness that we have, where I like to get the A no matter what I do, so now I don't have to work for it. Right? So we could all agree on that would just make us all equally lazy. Right? So there's going to be, there might be overlap between, I mean, we'll have to bend the bubbles a little bit, maybe three-dimensional or something, right? But like, between the access and sufficiency, like the biases, we might all be biased in the same way. We might all hate foreigners or Jews or whatever equally, right? Just because there's none among us. But that doesn't make it a general will, because that's not the rational thing to do. So it's like, if there's a group of addicts who are now running the rehab clinic, right? And the first moment of first proposal is free cocaine for everybody. So, like, okay, they're all happy in the sense that they all accepted that rule. They're not being forced in any way. But are they free in the sense of like being autonomous? No. Right? They're just equally run by their addiction. Now all of them are together run by their addiction. And so that's not good enough.
What is his, what is he using as a basis for categorizing some things as rational and some things as not?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's an important question. He doesn't tell you much. It's a short piece, right? Followers of Rousseau have tried a variety of proposals. There's a debate that goes on right now.
That's where my objection rests earlier.
Yeah, that's a deep question. It's a complicated question. It's frankly a question that I don't know enough about to really get into now, just because that literature irritates the crap out of me. If you want to know, Google, like if you go to I don't know if you know the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's an online, Google public reason in there. You can have a ball, you can have a blast on what the current, really the cutting edge of that type of discussion is. Anyway, whether you accept it or not, that's the idea anyway. And you're right that to fully work it out, you need to say a lot more. But that's where he wants to go. Thought I saw someone raise their hand. Yeah. Sure.
It seems to me that the general will is just whatever protects life, limb, and eyesight and encourages others to do so, right?
That's going to be part of the general will, yeah, presumably, right? Like that's the kind of stuff that we can all equally accept.
Right, because nobody wants to die or get hurt
right.
or whatever by other people.
Right.
Or by anything, right? So.
But it might not be just that, right? It might be more, of course, Rousseau would say the way you find out is by actually doing it, right? So actually having a democracy and having people put forward proposals and discuss them and then have a vote and then see if we can get there. He's going to be, we're not quite getting there, but he has an idea about why he thinks a democracy will get you to the rational part and not just all the addicts together, right?
Right.
And
if you have all the addicts together, then new people who are born and grow up in that they think that doing cocaine is all right, and then it hurts them and they didn't really have any. Yeah,
it could be. So there could be that there is just enough variety between people that we are just so different that when we live together that there's no one bias that we all share, right?
Yeah.
That seems to be what Rousseau hints at. He doesn't quite say. At other times, he seems to be saying that the activity of democratic decision making, so to have to put something forward as a political proposal to everybody, sort of forces you to be more rational. So you kind of you filter out the crappy parts, and you wouldn't say you wouldn't be 55 years old and say, oh crap, I forgot to save for my retirement. I couldn't. I want to have the government pay retirement double the retirement of everybody or something, right?
Right.
Because you wouldn't be able to say that, because that's just you saying, hey, I was stupid. How about you pay for it, right?
Yeah.
And then nobody's going to accept it. So he thinks, well, that filter it out. You want to say that? You say, well, that has no chance. So.
Okay.
Right. All right. Anyone else? The plan was to get further than this.
Sorry, that's my fault.
No. Well, it's good to discuss these things. I bet you will remember more of this part than of the parts that I just talked about. So. We got 5 minutes left. That's not enough to get to the next slide because the next slide is a long story. So we'll pick up there next time. Free 5 minutes. Woohoo. See you next time.